it's fascinating, these papers, aren't they? So I think there's a number of things. I mean, the first thing is, as you alluded to, the papers are from there, I think, about 10 years ago. So they're not, that they don't reflect necessarily current thinking, not least to your point about China. Russia and China have cozied up considerably since then, although we shouldn't be under no illusions who's the daddy in that relationship. It's China, it's not Putin. Far from it. So I guess that dynamic has changed. The second thing is, you could have, if you like, doctrine that sets out, in theory, in the case of a war game, what are the circumstances in which you would go to tactical nuclear weapons. Of course, the practical reality is it's never as clear cut as that. And ultimately, President Putin would be making judgments advised by Gerasimov, his head of the armed forces, and Lavrov, his defense secretary, his foreign secretary, and others.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine with Major General Rupert Jones, who is previously Britain's most senior commander in Iraq. Rupert, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
James, delighted to be with you. Thank you.
Can we just start by getting your summary of what we're seeing on the front line at the moment? Obviously, we've had the Russians capturing Avdiivka. It seems that their offensive operations in that region are maintaining quite a high intensity. What is your assessment of where we are currently?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be clear-eyed that at the moment, and probably for the first time in the war, to take a view on that, it feels as though the Russians have they have the upper hand on the battlefield at a land tactical level. They've got a bit of initiative. Avdiivka, clearly, that was a disappointing. You might use the word tactical defeat for the Ukrainians. Normally it's perfectly valid on the battlefield to give up ground. You trade space for time. It's a perfectly valid tactic. Of course, for the Ukrainians, they can't ordinarily do that because it's their sovereign territory. Every inch of Ukraine matters to them. And so that's kind of taken away some of their tactical options. So something like Avdiivka, they hold, when in pure military terms, you might want to kind of give it up. So anyway, in this case, they have given it up. And it does feel as though the Russians are trying to double down. They're trying to exploit that and build a bit of momentum around. I wouldn't overplay it. But this is, it's not great from a Ukrainian perspective. They want to stem that tide. I suspect what they're doing is falling back to fresh defensive positions. Hopefully those defensive positions are strong and they'll be able to block any further Russian advance.
Yeah, just talk me through the logistics of Ukraine finding those new defensive lines to the west of Avdiivka and making sure they can hold them.
Yeah, so again, what you would normally do is when you are going to trade some ground in the military parlance, you'd make sure that the position you're falling back to is as strong as possible. So you're falling back onto a bit of ground that you have pre-identified that is readily defendable. You've put in place all your defensive fortifications, trenches, and the like. And critically, you pick the ground that you're going to fall back to. I'm confident the Ukrainians will have done that. I don't have absolute insight on that. But of course, what the Russians will be trying to do is the flip of that. So they'll be trying to build up momentum against the Ukrainians. So as the Ukrainians are in the process of falling back, almost open up the tide and flood through. I'm confident the Ukrainians won't allow that to happen, but it's a competition that's going on.
And it was interesting, President Zelensky saying over the weekend that he expects Russia to launch a full-scale offensive in the late spring. And presumably the crucial thing now is for Ukraine to stop that momentum building on the Russian side. Yeah,
it feels very different, doesn't it, from this time last year? Here we are just beyond the 2-year anniversary. This time last year, all the talk was about the coming Ukrainian offensive. I think Zelensky is very sensibly playing the narrative in the other direction now, playing down Ukrainian aspirations in the short term, playing up Russian opportunity. And I suspect he's right. The Russians at one level, at a land tactical level, not strategically, at a land tactical level, have a little bit of momentum. And I think President Zelensky's right, and the Russians will wish to take advantage of that. Not least, of course, because there is the faux election about to take place in Russia. So Putin wants his tail up as much as possible as he goes into the false election.
And how big an issue is it at the moment for Ukraine? Just the lack of supply, the fact they're having to husband their materiel and ration supplies, ammunition, etc.
Oh, it's absolutely brutal. Nobody should underestimate what a big issue this is. And this has been building for a considerable period of time. The seeds of what we face now, you can play back to, so 16 odd months ago. So we're talking late 2022. When there was the in-depth discussion going on around the NATO table, do we, don't we, what do we provide to the Ukrainians? And for me, that was the moment where, for me, in the early months of the campaign, NATO leaders played a clever, nuanced balance in terms of supporting President Zelensky, but not going too far, because they were mindful of escalation. The risk of Russia going nuclear felt real. As the months of 2022 went on, it became clear that was, not impossible, but highly unlikely. And it was then that some leaders were saying, right, we need to double down our support to Ukraine, go all in with tanks, go all in with fast jets, and. And as you recall, through that winter, we lost months of wrangling about to provide tanks, not to provide tanks, to provide artillery, not to provide artillery. And those were the months the Ukrainians needed to really exploit their own momentum. So that was the seeds of the problem we saw through 2023, and here we are now, where the poor old Ukrainians are fighting, not just one hand tied behind their back, and they're kind of hopping on one leg at the same time, because they just don't have the munitions. This is a highly industrial war. The war that some commentators who don't pay that much interest to war routinely thought was over. We're into a new brave era. It's all about cyber. No, it's not. War is brutal. War is industrial. Wars typically take a long time. And when you're going to go toe-to-toe between two industrial nations like Russia and Ukraine, don't be surprised when the war is industrial in its nature. And the Ukrainians just don't have the ammunition to back that up. And Western nations are trying, but they are struggling to gear up their industrial base to keep pace with the sorts of amounts of, not least, artillery ammunition that has been used. And, so I've seen some commentators saying, the Russians are able to deploy about 6 times more artillery ammunition than the Ukrainians. With those sort of ratios, it is almost impossible for the Ukrainians to do anything except hold their ground. You simply can't go on to a ground offensive when, just picture it, these great big explosions. Picture World War One, when your troops are on the wrong end of that and the outgoing fire is a sixth of what's coming at you, your freedom to operate is very significantly reduced.
Yeah, and obviously there's the manpower advantage as well that Russia enjoys over Ukraine. Just on that, you mentioned NATO a moment ago. We've had these interesting comments from President Macron of France in the past 48 hours, where he sort of suggested that NATO troops, or at the very least troops from NATO countries, could be used on the front line in Ukraine. Now, it's worth saying America, the UK, Germany have come out and sort of dismissed those claims, and the Kremlin has pushed back against it very strongly, saying they would consider that a major escalation. But what was your reading of his comments?
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because, let's not kid ourselves. If NATO troops deployed to Ukraine in anything other than how they are now, in a kind of an advisory capacity, then, of course, that's patently a huge escalation of the war. Doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but it is an absolute escalation of the war, and there is no NATO consensus about the idea of putting forces into Ukraine. That's the first thing to say. Categorically not. So why did President Macron do it? Who knows? The French, and Macron in particular, has a slight propensity for, putting these things out there. Does he do it because it was a kind of off the cuff comment? Possible, but doesn't seem terribly likely. He's an extremely smart statesman. Is he doing because he's just trying to put it out there and see how it lands, see how the ripples settle? Is he doing a little bit of socialization because he thinks downstream it could become a possibility? So he's just trying to gently put it out into the public consciousness. Hard to tell. I think on balance, I mean, I suppose there's two ways of doing it. There's one thing that sort of gets unhelpful because it shows a lack of unity within NATO, and Putin exploits that. On the other hand, just putting the things on the table to trigger a little bit of conversation isn't always a bad thing.
But it's interesting because I've heard some analysts make the point that maybe it was a mistake from the outset that NATO ruled out putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, because even if you don't seriously have any intention of doing it, by stating that publicly, you're showing your hand to your enemy, and then actually maybe it would have been better to keep that as an option.
I mean, I think there's a very valid conversation to be had there. I think looking back, maybe that did close down an option precipitously, and it's given Putin a bit of an out because he's confident that NATO aren't going to do that. I think, again, to be fair, you go back to where the conversation was when Russia first invaded, or invaded second time round in 2022. I think it is probably reasonable that NATO collectively and its member nations individually took that line. It's easy with the benefit of hindsight to say, yeah, I mean, it wasn't really going to escalate, was it? Well, it kind of didn't feel that way at the time. So yes, there are, you always typically at both a diplomatic level, but certainly a military level, you try and keep your powder as dry as possible to keep your adversary guessing. And by ruling it out, you've taken away a little bit of your some of your options, I guess. But you can come back to it, and arguably that's what Macron is doing.
And on the topic of potential escalation, we had, I think it was last month, the interesting comments from General Sir Patrick Sanders, the head of the army in the UK, implying that there might be at some point a need for a kind of citizen army that will fight Russia at some point down the line. Now, we've had the head of the armed forces, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, basically slapping down those comments. Just talk us through what the latest is on that, Rupert.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of really interesting things in that. I mean, firstly, to say General Sir Patrick Sanders is a very fine warrior. He's a friend, he's a colleague. I have the utmost respect for him. And I think his comments were well chosen. A number of our NATO allies have a much more involved society in their national security conversation. We don't. We walk the streets of London. We think we're untouchable, and it's out with our experience. I think what Patrick is pointing to is, well, is that still right? And he wasn't saying, hey, we need a conscription. He was putting the conversation on the table to trigger a debate. And I think the debate that followed was quite an interesting, largely well-informed debate. Of course, some people go off on tangents with it. But he put the debate on the table. Seems to me that's what our national leaders should be doing. And Patrick Sanders is the leader of one of our national institutions. And so for me, he was right to put it on the table. Oh, by the way, as far back as 2014, the then Chief of the General Staff, General Sir Nick Carter, in the aftermath of Afghanistan, was trying to say to government, if you'll be ready for future war, you need to get your munition production up, you need to get your vehicle spare parts industry up, and you need to look at how you regrow the British Army in time of crisis. So Patrick is circling back to a debate that is not new in the British Army, and I think it's an important debate. To Admiral Radakin's response, I'm going to be really clear. I thought it was a deeply unhelpful intervention by the Chief of the Defence Staff yesterday for a number of reasons. Firstly, I don't think it's helpful for the Chief of the Defence Staff to come out and, the language is slapped down the head of the army. Totally unnecessary. He could have used much more nuanced language if he just wanted to box the debate a bit more. So I thought that was I mean, the only person who wins out of that is Putin. So I thought, with the greatest respect to the Chief of Defence Staff, that was a really unhelpful intervention. I also fundamentally disagree with what he said. This is about the defence of the realm, and it's right that we trigger a conversation in society about it. And that's what Patrick was doing, closing it down, saying this is a private matter. I'm afraid doesn't wash. I also don't buy his line that said, hey, look, everybody relax in the UK. We're not about to be invaded. No, of course we're not. But you're missing the point about NATO. An invasion of one, an attack on one is an attack on all. So it doesn't have to be an attack on the UK. If you go to Tallinn and Estonia, the threat feels pretty real, where we've got British troops, by the way. So no, London isn't necessarily about to be physically attacked. But the threat is real elsewhere in NATO. That's what NATO deterrence is all about. So I'm afraid I thought it was a clumsy and unhelpful intervention by the Chief of Defence Staff. You know, we need to be taking this threat very seriously, and we need to socialise the British public gently that the world order has changed, and that will have implications. It doesn't mean we're all going to war tomorrow, but it has implications. And you need to ease society into that conversation. So that's quite a strong worded response, but I think this is a really important issue, and we need the likes of Patrick Sanders while still in uniform. He retires soon. We don't want him saying it when he retires. We want him saying it while he's in uniform, and hats off to him for doing so.
And if there were an escalation with NATO, let's say Putin decides he wants to move on Estonia or Latvia or where have you, how soon do you think that could happen? I mean, how immediate would you say the threat is?
I don't think it's especially immediate. Hey, look, I'm no longer privy to any inside information, but we can see the Russian military are wholly fixed by what's going on in Ukraine. The idea that they could, in any meaningful way, concurrently, mount an incursion into, say, Estonia, I think is wholly unlikely. That is not to say they can't do other things. If you think back to when they went into Crimea in 2014, 2015, it wasn't a big ground incursion. People forgot about the little green men. There's other things that they can do where they flirt around the edges of Article 5. And that is possible. Do I think it's about to happen right now? No, I don't. But make no mistake, President Putin is an opportunist. And if you present him with an opportunity, he will walk straight through the door. That's why back into 2015 time, we put forces into Estonia, into Latvia, into Lithuania, into Poland, to make really clear to President Putin there is no opportunity. And the reality is, NATO is only as strong as its members. And the United Kingdom has historically been, behind the United States, the second biggest nation. We need to keep stepping up to that plate. And again, what's behind some of these conversations is a sense that we're not stepping up sufficiently to the plate. We can't expect the likes of Denmark, I don't pick on Denmark for any particular reason, to lean in if the United Kingdom, that assist, along with France, is the biggest defence nation in Europe. If we don't take some pain and lean in, why would Spain? Why would Denmark? Why would the Netherlands? And so on.
And it's interesting on Denmark because, it's quite a good example actually to pick out, because we've had them coming out recently saying they're going to give over their entire artillery supply to Ukraine. So albeit that quite a small thing in the grand scheme of things, symbolically, that is a massive commitment from Denmark, which probably lays down a marker for France and the UK to do our bit as well.
I think that's absolutely right. I get it. Our budget is under huge pressure. Of course it is. Inflation. I get it. But you can't, as a prime minister or as a politician, keep saying the number one responsibility of the government is the security of the nation, and then not commit to that, and not to recognise that the European security situation has changed, and that requires some really hard choices. And his predecessors were moving towards a 3% conversation of GDP. It doesn't matter whether it does matter whether it's 2.5 or 3%, but the bottom line is the current budget is insufficient. The British Army in particular, the Navy and the Air Force can point to some quite positive capability programs. The British Army has been underinvested in really since the end of Afghanistan. Its vehicle fleet is in a really poor state. If we're going to go toe-to, as an army, the entry standard is deploy what we call a war-fighting division. That's how you gain influence with the Americans. That's the unit of measure. And if you put in a war-fighting division, then the likes of Denmark and Estonia will give you forces to come in under your umbrella. If the United Kingdom can't put a war-fighting division in the field as part of the deterrence mechanism, then what do the likes of Denmark and the Netherlands do? They can't put a division in the field, because historically they don't have that capability. So if UK isn't going to do it, well, kind of who is? Germany's going to increase their defence spending, but they'll take time. France potentially can. Of course, the Americans can. But again, it's not good enough for our politicians, or indeed for the Chief of Defence Staff, to be saying, we'll just have these quiet conversations in private. They don't work. They don't work. And Ben Wallace was frustrated when he didn't secure the budget he felt he needed. He's now talking about that very publicly. I get it. I understand our senior uniform chiefs have got to run a careful line. But to speak in public and say there's nothing to see here, we're all good, that's not okay, because I don't judge our armed forces to be fit for purpose for the threats we face today. And that should be a serious national conversation going into this election.
Just wanted to ask you, Rupert, in the event of a future conflict with Russia invading, let's say, the Baltic States, how important do you think Kaliningrad could be? I mean, could that be one of the justifications Putin uses? I mean, he likes to present offensive operations as a defensive mechanism. The denazification of Ukraine, as he would see it, was presented as something defensive. Could he justify an incursion into the Baltics?
Defensive mechanism. Forgive me to listeners who are not familiar with Kaliningrad. It's a little island of Russia that is cut off from the rest of Russia, and over by the kind of Poland area, for those northern Poland up around there, without going into the geography too much. And it's a strong defensive bastion for the Russians. They've got all sorts of very, very high-end defensive capabilities there. And he can achieve a land bridge across to Kaliningrad. That's all, an established thing. But of course, he could potentially use that as it's no longer acceptable for me to have a land bridge. I've got to secure Kaliningrad. There's any number of potential pretexts he could use. So he could say, "Hey, look, there's a big Russian diaspora in Estonia. They want to be back in Mother Russia. I'm just coming to their aid." So there's any number of false narratives that he can potentially use. If we show him weakness, if we show him strength, I'm confident he won't do that. He might play around the edges, but I'm confident he won't do that. And again, to the British listeners, be really clear. There's significant numbers of British troops up in Estonia to deter President Putin. If Russia probes into Estonia, be under no illusions, those British soldiers will be fighting to defend themselves. So this is a very, very serious conversation. We don't put troops up into Estonia lightly. We put them up there, say, around 2015. And worth saying, why did we, Britain, most people won't remember this, but I do because I was involved in it, why did we pick putting our troops in Estonia, not Latvia or Lithuania? Really clear. Because the Estonians fought alongside us in Helmand province in Afghanistan. We had Estonian troops under command, and they were fighting and dying with British troops. And simplicity, there's a kind of blood debt. So why we go to Latvia or Lithuania when we fought with Estonians? And if I could just see a little vignette that tells you how serious this is for the Estonians. So in late 2012, I was in Tallinn. I was about to command the British forces in Afghanistan, and so I went to have meetings in Estonia to understand, what their national position. And I was having lunch with a senior official from their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I said, "Look, I'm something really naive. We love having Estonian troops with us in Helmand. You're fantastic, great fighters, but you're not a global. You don't have a global footprint. What's in Helmand for you? Why are you there with us?" And he looked me in the eye and he said, "It's Article 5. We're binding you in. So if we ever come under attack, my language, not his, this is sort of blood debt." That was way back when nobody thought Putin posed a threat at all. The Estonians were clear-eyed about it. We will get on the global stage with NATO. We'll go to Afghanistan because when the time comes, we need to buy you into our own defense. That's how serious these countries take this threat.
That is genuinely fascinating. That's really, really insightful. I wanted to ask you, Rupert, whilst we've got you, just about a story that's come out in the last 24 hours or so. The Times has been reporting on it, leaked Russian military documents showing Moscow's criteria for the use of tactical nuclear weapons, which of course has been one of the kind of fears that we've all had ever since this conflict started. And what's interesting is the files describe hypothetical situations in which Russia could use them. And two big takeaways from me, but I'm keen to get yours. First of all, that includes an invasion by China, which probably raises a few eyebrows. And secondly, just the fact that sort of the criteria that they're using seems to be a lower threshold for the use of tactical nuclear weapons than perhaps we previously thought.
Yeah, it's fascinating, these papers, aren't they? So I think there's a number of things. Well, the first thing is, as you alluded to, the papers are from there, I think, about 10 years ago. So they're not, that they don't reflect necessarily current thinking, not least to your point about China. Russia and China have cozied up considerably since then, although we shouldn't be under no illusions. Who's the daddy in that relationship? It's China. It's not Putin. Far from it. So I guess that dynamic has changed. The second thing is, you could have this like doctrine that sets out, in theory, in the case of a war game, what are the circumstances in which you would go to tactical nuclear weapons. Of course, the practical reality is it's never as clear-cut as that. And ultimately, President Putin would be making judgments advised by Gerasimov, his head of the armed forces, and Lavrov, his defense secretary, his foreign secretary, and others. And I think what we should, despite these papers, we should really reflect that we sort of don't know the circumstances in which they would use. Go back to your earlier question about, did NATO kind of cut away an option by saying early on they wouldn't use put troops into Ukraine? In a way, the same sort of applies. You don't want to set out to your adversary too clearly the circumstance in which thresholds might be crossed, because you want your adversary guessing. And of course, that's exactly what happened at the front end of the Ukraine invasion. NATO were kind of trying to work out, where's the threshold? Are we going to cross an inadvertent red line with Putin? And we concluded on the whole, no, we weren't. So these papers are interesting, but I think we should, we shouldn't read too much into it. In any conflict, our very, very senior decision makers, both military and political, would be trying to judge. We used to talk about the zone of uncertainty around an action. If we take an action towards Russia, what their counteraction might be, and you're trying to predict their reaction to your action, but you don't know. We call it the zone of uncertainty. By the time you get up to the nuclear threshold, that zone of uncertainty is pretty broad.
Because there was always that fit, particularly at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Putin's potential use of tactical nuclear weapons as one of the great justifications for trying not to escalate the conflict further. And it's interesting, maybe in recent weeks, we've heard some language that implies that the West is more prepared for escalation if it comes to that. I thought it was interesting that, obviously we've got the situation with the aid package held up in US Congress. Hopefully that gets approved soon. But there's a report that if that does get approved, one of the first things that the US will give to Ukraine is longer range attacker missiles, which previously the justification for not giving those was it might provoke escalation further because they might be used in Crimea or even within Russia. So do you sense a change there that maybe the Western fear of escalation is diminishing a bit?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think as I touched on earlier, I mean, I think the um, this is a competition, and we don't know what Putin will do. But the nations have got intelligence, they've got diplomatic assessments, and they're making judgments all the time. And I think their broad judgment has been for some time that Russia isn't about to escalate very significantly and very unlikely to go towards tactical nuclear weapons. And that undoubtedly gives Western decision makers more options. Again, for my taste, they have still been too cautious. So leave aside, frankly, the disgrace of what's been going on in US Congress that is frankly nothing to do with Ukraine at all. It's everything to do with Russia, to do with American domestic politics. Leave that aside. I think some nations have been too cautious in offering those more capable weapon systems. I'm confident if President Biden, for example, says to Zelensky, "Look, we're going to give you this long range capability, but won't betide you if you use it into sovereign Russia." I'm pretty sure Zelensky will stand by those requirements. He's not stupid, and he knows that America will know as soon as that rule is broken. So you can give these weapon systems with criteria. I mean, I was just saying, because we haven't touched on it yet. We touched on the fact that the Russians appear to have a bit of tactical momentum on the land battlefield, but that is not to say that the overall momentum of the war has swung. Ukraine, I still think, are doing a very impressive job at holding Russia at risk by striking into Russia's depth. That is lending the lie to Putin about the special military operation et al. So I think that's good. And secondly, as we know, they've been doing really impressive things into the Black Sea in terms of damaging and threatening the Russian Black Sea fleet. So whilst on the grubby, nasty, muddy, cold, trench-ridden battlefield of the front line, small gains, and at the moment the small gains are more in Russia's favour than in Ukraine's favour. If you lift back up from that, Ukraine are still playing some really impressive cards. The debate will be what happens through 2024. So Zelensky, saying, well, Putin might be about to conduct an offensive. I think Zelensky and indeed Western leaders will play down any Ukrainian options this year because they don't want to raise expectations again. And that'll be for one of two reasons. Firstly, because they're going to do something and they don't want us all talking about it. And that'll be a perfectly valid thing. And I clearly have no insights as to whether or not that's the case or not. Or because they genuinely are not in a position to do anything in 2024 and they need to play a long game, build up through 24 to be ready to do something in 2025 for sake of argument. If that is the case, Zelensky and his team will be thinking very carefully, the hub plans already, about, okay, what do? We can't just sit and take it on the battlefield. You can't just defend. In the military, we always say the best form of defense is attack. So where do you attack to keep the pressure off your own forces, even if you don't have any great expectation of a big breakthrough on the battlefield?
Major General Rupert Jones, we always appreciate your insight and expertise. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been an absolute pleasure, James. Thank you.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.